Picture this. It's 5,000 winters before the first white trappers ever laid eyes on the Rocky Mountains. The Shoshone people are moving through their ancestral homeland, and they're about to stumble upon something that will echo through history in ways they could never imagine. They're walking through groves of massive spruce trees, and suddenly, one of them notices something remarkable. The snow that's been falling for days. It's not reaching the ground beneath these particular trees. Now, you have to understand what this means. We're talking about temperatures that would kill a modern human in minutes, 50 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that turns your breath into ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. The kind of cold that makes the trees themselves crack like gunshots in the night. And yet, here in these sacred groves where ancient spruces grew dense and tall, something different was happening. The air stayed mysteriously warmer. Think about that for a moment. These indigenous peoples had developed survival skills over thousands of years, passed down through countless generations. They could read the landscape like we read a book, and what they discovered in those spruce groves was nothing short of revolutionary. The interlocking branches above created a natural ceiling, a living roof that trapped heat and blocked the killing wind. The dense needle coverage filtered the air, creating a microclimate that could mean the difference between life and death. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Fast forward to the winter of 1823. The fur trade is in full swing, and we have this character named Jedediah Smith. Now, Smith wasn't just any mountain man. This guy was tough as nails, but he was also smart. He paid attention. He listened to the indigenous peoples he encountered, unlike many of his contemporaries who dismissed native knowledge as primitive superstition. And in that brutal winter of 1823, all of Smith's attention to detail was about to pay off in the most dramatic way imaginable. Smith had been mauled by a grizzly bear. Picture the scene. He's bleeding, weakened by hunger, stumbling through the Wind River range as temperatures plummeted to levels that would challenge modern Arctic gear. His fellow trappers, practical men who understood the mathematics of survival, had already written him off as dead. They'd seen too many good men disappear into the white silence of a Rocky Mountain winter. But Smith remembered something. An old Crow warrior had shown him how to read the forest for salvation. Not just any part of the forest, mind you, but specific signs that most white men couldn't even see. The way certain trees grew together, the pattern of snow accumulation, the subtle differences in air movement that could indicate a place where a man might survive when everything else screamed death. Smith found what he was looking for. A grove of ancient spruces, their branches, so thick they formed natural walls. Using techniques that had been passed down through generations of indigenous peoples, techniques that represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth, Smith built his first spruce hollow. Now, this wasn't just throwing some branches together and hoping for the best. This was engineering. This was architecture. This was sacred knowledge. Smith wove branches in specific patterns that his Crow teacher had shown him. He packed snow in precise ways that created insulation while maintaining structural integrity. He created a living shelter that literally breathed with warmth. The spruce needles above filtered the wind and trapped heated air. The carefully constructed walls allowed air circulation while preventing heat loss. The entrance was positioned to catch morning sunlight while avoiding the prevailing winds that could steal precious warmth in seconds. For 3 weeks, Smith lived in that spruce hollow. 3 weeks in the kind of conditions that modern survival experts would consider a death sentence. And when his brigade finally found him, expecting to collect a frozen corpse, they discovered something that challenged everything they thought they knew about winter survival. Smith wasn't just alive. He was thriving. His shelter was maintaining temperatures 40 degrees warmer than the killing cold outside. 40 degrees. That's the difference between deadly hypothermia and comfortable survival. That's the difference between becoming another cautionary tale and living to pass on revolutionary knowledge that would transform the entire fur trade of North America. The construction required sacred knowledge that went far beyond simple shelter building. Smith had learned to choose trees of the right age, understanding that spruces needed decades of growth to develop the proper branch density. He could read wind patterns in the way snow accumulated on different sides of grove. He understood how heated air moved through spruce needles, creating convection currents that could be harnessed for maximum warmth. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. The indigenous peoples who originated this knowledge knew that spruce pitch, when mixed with animal fat, could seal gaps while still allowing the shelter to breathe. They understood that the entrance had to face away from prevailing winds but toward the morning sun, capturing precious solar energy when it was available. Most critically, they knew the spiritual protocols that went along with this survival technique. These weren't just practical instructions. They were sacred practices, prayers of gratitude to the trees whose sacrifice made survival possible. Offerings left for the forest spirits who allowed humans to share their domain, promises to take only what survival demanded and to give back when abundance returned. When word of Smith's miraculous survival spread through the mountain man community, it didn't just create curiosity, it created a revolution. Because Smith had proven something that would change everything. With the right knowledge, a man could not only survive the worst winter the Rockies could throw at him, but he could do it in comfort. He could do it while maintaining his strength. He could do it while continuing to trap the prime winter pelts that commanded the highest prices back east. The secret of the Spruce Hollow was about to transform the entire economics of the fur trade. And the men who mastered this ancient indigenous wisdom were about to become the winter kings of the Rocky Mountains. But Smith's survival was just the beginning, because in a few short years, a man named Antoine Clement would take this knowledge and create something even more remarkable, something that would bring together different worlds of winter wisdom in ways that would define the very character of the American frontier. The question is, what happens when French voyageur techniques meet Blackfoot wisdom in the depths of a Rocky Mountain winter? What happens when cultures collide inside a spruce hollow during the storm that mountain men would later call the 3-day death? The answer would surprise everyone. Antoine Clement was the kind of man who shouldn't have existed, but thank God he did. Half French-Canadian, half Blackfoot, Clement lived between worlds in a way that most people of his era couldn't even imagine. His father had been a voyageur from Quebec, one of those legendary paddlers who could sing their canoes through impossible rapids. His mother was Blackfoot nobility, a woman whose family had been reading the signs of Rocky Mountain weather for more generations than anyone could count. And in the winter of 1828, all of that mixed heritage was about to save lives in the most spectacular way. Picture the scene. The storm that trappers would later call the 3-day death is building on the horizon. Modern meteorologists would classify this as a historic blizzard, the kind of weather system that makes national news and shuts down entire states. But in 1828, there was no weather service, no satellite imagery, no warning systems. There were just men scattered across thousands of square miles of wilderness and a storm approaching that would test every survival skill they possessed. Clement was leading 12 men through the Yellowstone headwaters when he felt it coming. Not saw it, felt it. The way the wind shifted, the way his horse's ears twitched, the way the very air seemed to thicken with impending violence. His Blackfoot blood told him this wasn't just another winter storm. This was the kind of weather that could erase entire brigades from history. Most mountain men would have pushed hard for the nearest fort or trading post. But Clement had something different in mind. He led his group into a spruce grove that his mother's people had been using for winter shelter since before European diseases ever reached the Americas. And there, using knowledge that bridged two completely different survival traditions, he built something remarkable. While other brigades were losing half their members to that 3-day storm, Clement's group didn't just survive. They emerged stronger. Their secret would spread through the mountains like wildfire, but not before creating something unprecedented in the American frontier experience. Inside Clement's Spruce Hollow, cultures blended in ways that would define the very character of Western expansion. Think about what was happening here. You had French voyageurs, men whose ancestors had been navigating the waterways of North America for 2 centuries, singing their traditional paddle songs while indigenous women taught intricate beadwork. American farm boys from places like Ohio and Kentucky were learning to make pemmican, that concentrated food that could sustain a man through weeks of hard travel. Spanish traders from Santa Fe were sharing techniques for preserving pelts that they'd learned from generations of commerce along the mountain routes. The shelter itself became a university of survival, where knowledge flowed as freely as the smoke from their carefully tended fires. But the real genius was in how Clement's wife, the indigenous woman known as Singing Bird, transformed the practical space into something that nourished both body and spirit. She introduced the practice of hanging sage and sweetgrass, creating an atmosphere that soothed nerves and lifted morale during the long dark months when the sun barely cleared the mountain peaks. You have to understand the psychology of what was happening here. These men were trapped together in a space roughly the size of a modern living room for days at a time. In normal circumstances, that kind of close quarters would have led to conflict, maybe violence. Mountain men weren't exactly known for their patience or diplomacy. But something about the Spruce Hollow environment, something about the way indigenous wisdom had shaped the space, created harmony instead of tension. The daily rhythm inside a properly built Spruce Hollow followed ancient patterns that connected these frontier men to thousands of years of human survival wisdom. Morning began with checking the ventilation holes, a task that required both scientific understanding and intuitive feel. Too open and precious heat escaped into the killing cold outside. Too closed and smoke accumulated, creating a choking atmosphere that could drive men to make fatal decisions. The person responsible for this check held the lives of everyone in the shelter in their hands. The fire represented the beating heart of the entire operation. Built from specific woods that burned long and smokeless, it never died completely. Not ever. Women and men took turns through the night feeding it single sticks, maintaining the delicate balance between too much heat, which could melt the structural snow, and cause collapse, and too little heat, which meant death by degrees. Storage spaces carved into the snow walls held furs, food, and tools in precise organization that would impress a modern efficiency expert. Everything had its place, and everyone knew where everything belonged. In a survival situation, being able to find what you needed in complete darkness could mean the difference between life and death. But perhaps most remarkably, the acoustic properties of the spruce walls created an intimate space where whispers carried clearly, but outside sounds stayed muffled. This created a peaceful cocoon against winter's rage, a place where men could think clearly and make good decisions, even when the world outside had become a howling nightmare of wind and snow. Power dynamics inside these hollows shifted according to knowledge, not physical strength or social standing from the outside world. The keeper of the fire held authority equal to the brigade leader. Think about that. In the normal hierarchy of a trapping expedition, the brigade leader was absolute authority. His word was law. But inside the Spruce Hollow, survival trumped everything. The person who understood fire management, who could read the subtle signs that indicated when ventilation needed adjustment, who knew which woods burned clean and which created dangerous smoke, that person held power. Those who could read weather signs through the behavior of spruce needles became prophets of survival. They could predict when the wind would shift, when the temperature would drop, when it was safe to venture outside, and when attempting to leave the shelter would be suicide. Young trappers paid invaluable pelts to learn from indigenous elders how to identify the subtle differences between a grove that would shelter and one that would collapse under snow weight. This knowledge transfer represented something unprecedented in the often hostile relationship between indigenous peoples and European settlers. Inside, Spruce Hollow's survival necessity created a temporary equality where wisdom mattered more than skin color or cultural background. Clement himself embodied this new frontier reality. He could sing French songs that his father had taught him while weaving branches in patterns his mother's people had perfected over millennia. He understood both the Catholic prayers that comforted the voyageurs and the indigenous ceremonies that honored the spirits of the forest. In a world that usually demanded choosing sides, Clement had found a way to honor both halves of his heritage. But the most profound development was how this blending of cultures created innovations that neither tradition could have achieved alone. Clement discovered that French techniques for waterproofing canoes could be adapted to seal spruce hollow walls more effectively. Blackfoot understanding of wind patterns, combined with voyageur knowledge of air circulation to create ventilation systems of remarkable sophistication. Spanish methods for preserving meat merged with indigenous plant knowledge to create food storage techniques that could sustain larger groups for longer periods. The winter of 1828 proved that the spruce hollow wasn't just a survival technique, it was a crucible for creating something entirely new on the American frontier, a place where different ways of knowing could merge to create solutions that no single culture could have imagined. When spring finally came and Clement's group emerged from their winter sanctuary, word of their success spread through the mountains faster than news of a rich beaver stream. Because they had proven something revolutionary, that winter in the Rockies didn't have to be an enemy to be endured. With the right knowledge, it could become an ally that provided opportunities unavailable in any other season. The era of the Winter Kings was about to begin. Between 1830 and 1840, something extraordinary happened in the Cozas, Rocky Mountains. Mastery of the spruce hollow technique didn't just separate the living from the dead anymore, it separated the mountain nobility from everyone else. And at the top of that hierarchy stood a man whose name would echo through frontier legend, Kit Carson. Now, Carson's reputation today rests mostly on his later exploits as a scout and Indian fighter. But among the mountain men of the 1830s, Carson earned his legendary status through something far more impressive than gunfighting. He survived what the trappers called the 50 Below Challenge. Picture this. Carson spent an entire January above 8,000 feet, using only traditional tools and spruce hollow knowledge. An entire January. At altitudes where the air is so thin that every breath burns your lungs. At temperatures that would freeze exposed skin in minutes. Modern Arctic explorers with space-age gear would consider this a death sentence. Carson did it with techniques passed down from indigenous peoples and innovations developed by men like Antoine Clement. And he didn't just survive, he thrived. Carson's success inspired an entire generation of trappers to push deeper into previously impossible winter territories. Because Carson had proven something that changed everything. Winter mastery could open up the richest trapping grounds at precisely the time when pelts were thickest and most valuable. Think about the economics of what was happening here. The fur trade had always been limited by seasons. Spring and fall were prime trapping times. But winter had been essentially off-limits to all but the most desperate or foolish. The cold made travel dangerous, the snow made trap lines nearly impossible to maintain, and the risk of death was so high that most companies simply shut down operations until spring. But brigades with spruce hollow masters could operate year-round. They could trap prime winter pelts when fur was at its absolute thickest and most valuable. A beaver pelt, taken in January, was worth 3 times what the same pelt would bring in summer. Ermine, fox, and other winter-specific furs commanded prices that made men wealthy overnight. The Hudson's Bay Company, that ruthless commercial empire that had dominated the North American fur trade for centuries, began offering triple wages to any man who could prove his hollow building skills. Triple wages. In an industry where men routinely risked their lives for modest pay, that kind of money represented life-changing opportunity. The American Fur Company, desperate to compete with their British rivals, sent spies to infiltrate indigenous camps, trying to steal construction secrets that had been refined over thousands of years. Think about that for a moment. These massive commercial enterprises, with resources that dwarfed anything individual trappers could imagine, were reduced to industrial espionage to acquire knowledge that a few dozen mountain men had learned through respect and collaboration with native peoples. A skilled hollow builder earned more than 5 trappers combined. Their knowledge was literally worth its weight in beaver pelts, and in a world where wealth was measured in furs, that made these men richer than kings. But the technique itself continued to evolve, as mountain men added their own innovations to the ancient indigenous foundation. Jim Bridger, that legendary explorer who would later guide wagon trains and railroad surveys, discovered that reflecting walls made from woven branches and ice could double a fire's heat output. Bridger understood something about physics that wouldn't be formally described by scientists for decades. how to create reflective surfaces that captured and redirected heat energy. His innovation meant that spruce hollows could maintain comfortable temperatures with half the fuel consumption. The Sublette brothers, who would become some of the wealthiest men in the fur trade, perfected a double wall system that created insulation, rivaling modern materials. They learned to construct an inner wall and an outer wall with a carefully calculated air gap between them. This dead air space provided insulation that could keep the interior of a spruce hollow warm enough for men to work in shirt sleeves, while the temperature outside dropped to levels that killed unprotected humans in minutes. Black Harris, the legendary scout whose stories were so outrageous that people assumed they were fiction, developed portable components that could transform any suitable grove into a shelter within hours. Harris created a kit of prefabricated elements, specially carved joining pieces, pre-woven wall sections, portable fire reflectors. With Harris's system, an experienced team could establish a fully functional spruce hollow faster than modern camping enthusiasts could set up a tent. These innovations spread through the annual rendezvous gatherings, those legendary meetings where trappers from across the Rocky Mountain region came, together to trade, resupply, and share knowledge. Men wagered valuable pelts on whose shelter could maintain warmth longest. Competitions emerged to see who could build the most efficient hollow, who could survive in the most extreme conditions, who could push the boundaries of what human beings could endure in winter mountains. But perhaps the most profound development was the mountain man sign language that evolved for silent communication between shelters. You have to understand the environment these men operated in. Sound carried differently in the thin mountain air, especially in winter when everything was muffled by snow. A spoken conversation could alert predators, both animal and human, to the presence of valuable furs and supplies. But the spruce hollows were often built in clusters, small communities of shelters that needed to coordinate hunting strategies, share weather information, and maintain security. So they developed a complex system of gestures visible through the tenure-to stay, transparent ice windows that mountain men learned to install in their shelter walls. These weren't simple pointing and gesturing. This was a sophisticated language capable of conveying complex hunting strategies, detailed weather warnings, and intricate trade negotiations. Think about the intellectual achievement this represents. These rough frontier men, many of whom could barely read or write, created a visual communication system sophisticated enough to conduct business negotiations through shelter walls. They could plan elaborate hunting strategies involving multiple teams across miles of territory. They could share philosophical discussions, and even poetry, through elegant hand movements visible in firelight through ice windows. On crystal-clear winter nights, when the aurora borealis painted the sky in impossible colors, entire conversations about the meaning of life flowed silently between shelters. Men who spent their days setting traps and skinning animals revealed themselves as poets and philosophers when the long winter darkness gave them time to think and reflect. The sign language became so sophisticated that it influenced trade relationships far beyond the mountains. When these men emerged from their winter sanctuaries and traveled to trading posts and rendezvous gatherings, they brought with them communication skills that gave them advantages in negotiations with merchants, suppliers, and even government officials. But more than economics or innovation, the Spruce Hollow Masters represented something new in American culture. Men who had learned to thrive in conditions that would challenge modern technology. They had mastered an environment so harsh that it defeated most people who attempted to conquer it. But they hadn't conquered it through force or technology. They had learned to dance with it, to understand its rhythms, to work with natural systems instead of against them. In doing so, they had become something unprecedented. Americans who combined indigenous wisdom with European determination to create survival skills that surpassed anything either culture could achieve alone. The Winter Kings of the Rocky Mountains had created a golden age of human adaptation. But golden ages, as history teaches us, don't last forever. Change was coming to the mountains, change that would test everything these remarkable men had built. The question was, could ancient wisdom survive in a world that was rapidly forgetting the value of indigenous knowledge? The 1840s brought the beginning of the end, and it came faster than anyone could have imagined. Beaver populations across the Rocky Mountains crashed from decades of intensive trapping. The animals that had built an entire economy, that had drawn thousands of men into the wilderness, that had created fortunes and legends, were simply disappearing. But that wasn't even the killing blow. The killing blow came from an unexpected direction. Fashion. Silk replaced felt in hat, making back east. Think about that for a moment. All of this incredible knowledge, all of these survival innovations, all of the cultural fusion that had created the winter kings of the Rocky Mountains was being undermined by wealthy gentlemen in New York and London who decided they preferred silk hats to beaver felt. The great rendezvous gatherings ceased, those legendary meetings where mountain men had gathered to trade, compete, and share knowledge simply stopped happening. There wasn't enough money in the fur trade anymore to justify the massive logistics of bringing together trappers from across thousands of square miles of wilderness. And then came the lost winter of 1847. 17 inexperienced 49ers, gold seekers who thought they understood frontier survival because they'd read some romanticized newspaper accounts of mountain man adventures, ignored old-timers' warnings about proper shelter construction. They'd heard stories about Spruce hollows. Of course, everyone had heard the legends, but they thought they could improvise, thought they could figure it out as they went along. Their frozen bodies, found the following spring in collapsed attempts at Spruce hollows, served as grim reminders that this knowledge could not be faked or rushed. You couldn't just throw some branches together and hope for the best. This was engineering refined over thousands of years, techniques that required deep understanding of physics, weather patterns, and forest ecology. The bodies told a story of hubris and ignorance, shelters built with the wrong species of trees, ventilation systems that created deadly carbon monoxide accumulation, fire placement that melted structural elements and caused catastrophic collapse. These men had died not from lack of courage or determination, but from lack of respect for the complexity of knowledge they'd attempted to shortcut. Meanwhile, native peoples watched their sacred groves invaded by wagon trains and settlements. The ancient spruces that had sheltered generations for thousands of years fell to sawmills, feeding the insatiable appetite of westward expansion. Trees that had taken centuries to reach the proper size and density for shelter construction were cut down to build houses and barns for farmers who had no idea what they were destroying. It was cultural vandalism on an almost incomprehensible scale. Singing Bird. Antoine Clement's wife, who had become an elder respected across multiple tribes, established teaching camps where she desperately tried to preserve the knowledge for future generations. She understood what was happening better than most. The knowledge that had sustained her people through countless winters, that had saved the lives of mountain men and created a unique fusion of survival wisdom, was disappearing faster than the beaver themselves. Singing Bird trained her granddaughter, Marie Clement, who would become the last great keeper of the traditional ways. Marie spoke 5 languages fluently: French from her grandfather, Blackfoot from her grandmother, English from the changing world around her, Spanish from traders, and the universal language of mountain survival that transcended cultural boundaries. Marie bridged the mountain man era to the modern world, carrying forward techniques that represented thousands of years of accumulated human wisdom about surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But she was swimming against a cultural tide that valued speed and efficiency over the patient observation and deep knowledge that Spruce Hollow construction required. Former mountain men found new purposes for their winter wisdom, adapting ancient techniques to serve a rapidly changing world. Jim Beckwourth, that legendary figure who had lived among the Crow people and learned their deepest survival secrets, guided railroad surveys through winter passes using Spruce Hollow techniques. Railroad companies discovered that Beckwourth's knowledge could keep survey crews alive and working in conditions that would have defeated conventional approaches. His shelters allowed railroad construction to continue through winter months, dramatically accelerating the completion of transcontinental routes. John Coulter's sons, inheriting their father's reputation and survival skills, taught military scouts heading into the Indian Wars. The United States Army, finally recognizing the value of indigenous survival knowledge, hired former mountain men to train soldiers in winter warfare techniques. Ironically, The government was now paying white men to teach skills that they could have learned directly from native peoples, if they had approached with respect instead of hostility. The knowledge transformed from survival necessity to specialized expertise, commanding high prices from wealthy expedition leaders and early conservationists seeking authentic wilderness experiences. Rich, Eastern gentlemen paid former mountain men small fortunes to guide them through genuine frontier adventures, never realizing that what they were experiencing was the dying echo of a cultural fusion that had taken generations to develop. But here's what makes this story remarkable. The knowledge didn't disappear completely. Today, in hidden groves across the Rocky Mountains, perfect spruce hollows still stand. Their builders have been dead for decades, but their construction was so sound, so perfectly adapted to the mountain environment, that these shelters endure like monuments to human ingenuity. Modern survival experts study these ancient structures, reverse engineering techniques that took millennia to perfect. Military survival schools send instructors to examine 100-year-old spruce hollows, trying to understand construction methods that allowed men to survive in conditions that would challenge modern Arctic gear. The mountain man's secret lives on in unexpected places. Elite military survival training programs that teach Special Forces soldiers how to build emergency shelters using techniques learned from Shoshone elders. Wilderness therapy programs that use spruce hollow construction to teach troubled young people patience, observation skills, and respect for natural systems. And most importantly, the knowledge survives in the indigenous communities who never forgot their ancestors' gift of winter wisdom. On reservations across the Mountain West, elders still teach young people how to read the forest for salvation. They still understand which groves will shelter and which will collapse. They still know the prayers and ceremonies that honor the spirits of the trees whose sacrifice makes human survival possible. The Spruce Hollow remains proof that the deepest knowledge comes not from conquering nature, but from learning to dance with her ancient rhythms. In our modern world of climate-controlled environments and technological solutions to every challenge, there's something profoundly important about remembering that human beings once learned to thrive in impossible conditions through patience, observation, and respect for the wisdom of people who had been reading the natural world for thousands of years. The winter kings of the Rocky Mountains are gone, but their legacy endures in every person who understands that survival isn't about dominating the environment. It's about becoming part of it. It's about learning that the greatest human achievements often come from humility rather than hubris, from listening rather than conquering, from recognizing that we are not separate from the natural world, but part of an intricate web of relationships that sustain all life. The secret of the Spruce Hollow was never really about shelter construction. It was about remembering that we belong here, that we can find our place in even the harshest environments, if we're willing to learn from those who came before us and approach the natural world with the respect it deserves. And perhaps, in our current age of environmental crisis and cultural division, that's a lesson we need now more than ever.